The gamelin plasma fire ripped through the marketplace, turning stalls to ash. Sergeant Kyle Davis dove for cover, the metallic tang of ionized air stinging his nostrils when a whimper cut through the chaos. He saw a small gamelin child, no older than 5, clutching a tattered doll, its large, insectoid eyes wide with terror. The marketplace, moments before a bustling hub of commerce on this contested world, was now a swirling vortex of destruction. Buildings crumbled under the relentless barrage, their Duracrete facades melting like candle wax. The air crackled with energy, the acrid smell of burning metal mixing with the sweet, sickly scent of charred flesh. Kyle, hardened and wary from years of fighting the gamelins, knew this symphony of carnage all too well. He'd seen 100 marketplaces reduced to rubble, 1,000 faces contorted in fear. But this whimper, it was different. It was the sound of pure, unfiltered terror, a sound that momentarily eclipsed the roar of the plasma fire. His gaze snapped to the source. A small gamelin child huddled behind a toppled fruit stand, clutching a doll missing an arm. Lyra, no older than 5 Earth years, was a miniature version of the insectoid warriors he'd been trained to kill. Her large, multifaceted eyes, usually shimmering with iridescent colors, were now clouded with fear, reflecting the orange glow of the burning marketplace. Plasma bolts flashed around her, each one a potential death sentence. Against every instinct honed by years of combat, against every order drilled into his skull, Kyle made a decision. He abandoned his assigned position behind a reinforced barricade and moved towards the child. It was a split-second choice, a reckless act of defiance against the cold logic of war. He scooped up Lyra, her small body surprisingly light in his arms. As he did, his fingers brushed against something wet and sticky on her leg. He glanced down and saw a dark stain spreading across her scaled skin, a telltale sign of a plasma burn. She whimpered again, a soft, pained sound. "Davis, what the hell are you doing?" Sergeant Miller's voice boomed over the comms, imbued with disbelief and anger. "Get back to your post. That's a goddamn gamelin." Other soldiers joined in, their shouts echoing across the ravaged marketplace. "Are you crazy, Davis? She's the enemy." The ingrained prejudice, the years of propaganda, fueled their outrage. Kyle ignored them, his focus narrowed to the immediate threat. He was now a target, not just for the gamelins, but for his own unit as well. He needed cover, and fast. He scanned the ruined marketplace, his eyes darting from one shattered building to another. A partially collapsed hab block, its roof caved in and its walls riddled with holes, was the only immediate option. It offered minimal protection, but it was better than nothing. Clutching Lyra securely, Kyle moved towards the dilapidated building, his senses on high alert. He could feel the heat of the plasma fire on his back, hear the screams of the wounded and dying. He could also feel Lyra trembling in his arms. He noticed she flinched at his touch, her multifaceted eyes widening with distrust. The war had poisoned everything, even the innocent. Gamelin soldiers, their guttural voices echoing through the ruins, began to converge on the marketplace. Their search pattern was tightening, their voices growing louder. They were searching for someone or something. He pushed forward, each step a gamble. He knew his actions had put him at odds with his unit, branded him a traitor in the eyes of some. He was now a target for both sides of the conflict, a lone human soldier carrying a wounded gamelin child through an active war zone. As they approached the dilapidated building, Kyle heard gamelin voices closing in. They were close, too close. Had they been spotted? Had they been spotted? Kyle's gut clenched. He scanned the skeletal remains of the building, the air thick with the scent of pulverized concrete and burning plastic. This structure, marked for demolition before the attack, offered little more than the illusion of safety. He set Lyra down as gently as he dared on a relatively clear patch of floor, the dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through a cracked wall. The building groaned under some distant impact. He needed to move, and fast. His eyes darted around, cataloging the fractured support beams, the precarious piles of debris, the gaping holes in the ceiling that offered a glimpse of the smoke-choked sky. Escape routes first. Lyra, however, wasn't interested in escape routes. She cowered, her large eyes fixed on Kyle, her small body trembling. She clutched the tattered doll so tightly its stuffing threatened to burst. Every muscle in her frame seemed coiled, ready to bolt. She shuffled backward, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the human soldier. Fear, raw and untamed, radiated from her. "Hey," Kyle murmured, keeping his voice low and even. He extended a hand slowly, palm up, a gesture of peace he'd learned from dealing with skittish wildlife back on Earth. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." He doubted she understood the words, but maybe she'd understand the tone. He needed to bridge this gap, and fast. He spotted it, then a small room tucked away in the back corner, partially shielded by a collapsed wall. It was still a mess, but it offered marginally better protection than the open space. He gestured towards it. "Come on, let's go over there." Kyle began clearing debris, tossing chunks of broken concrete and twisted metal aside. Beneath a pile of rubble, he unearthed a small, dented metal box. He pried it open. Inside, nestled amongst stained fabric, were a few vials of antiseptic, some bandages, and a half-empty bottle of water. Scavenged medical supplies. A small blessing in a sea of destruction. He knelt beside Lyra, his expression grim. The plasma burn on her leg was worse than he'd initially thought. The flesh around the wound was swollen and angry, and a thin trickle of blood stained her already dusty fur. It needed cleaning, and soon. He uncapped the water bottle, rationing it carefully. "This might sting a little," he said, more to himself than to her. He soaked a piece of the stained fabric and gently dabbed at the wound. Lyra flinched, her eyes squeezed shut, a suppressed cry escaping her lips. The sound tore at Kyle, a sharp reminder of the innocent caught in the crossfire. The guttural chatter of Gamelin soldiers echoed closer, punctuated by the crackle of plasma fire. They were close, too close. Kyle quickly finished cleaning the wound, applying a bandage as tightly as he dared. It was a temporary fix at best. They needed to move, and now. He scanned the room again, desperate for an escape route. Then he saw a narrow opening in the back wall, almost completely hidden by a pile of debris. It looked like a tunnel, dark and claustrophobic and probably unstable, but it was their only option. As he prepared to lift Lyra, a shout pierced the air. "Davis! Sergeant Davis, is that you?" Kyle froze. The voice was familiar, human. He peered through a crack in the wall, recognizing the silhouette outside. Private Jenkins, one of his squad. "Jenkins, what are you doing here?" "Davis, command's looking for you. They said you went AWOL. What's going on in there?" "I'm fine, Jenkins, just stay back." "Davis, I'm under orders to bring you in. And what's that I see? Is that a Gamelin?" Jenkins' voice dripped with disgust. "Davis, don't tell me you're harboring that brat. Command wants it eliminated." "She's just a kid, Jenkins," Kyle said, his voice hardening. "I'm not handing her over." "Davis, you're making a mistake. Stand down, surrender the Gamelin, and come back to the unit. I'm telling you this for your own good. Don't make me do this." "Do what, Jenkins?" "Shoot me? Are you going to shoot an unarmed child?" "Don't force my hand, Davis. You're bordering on treason. If you don't comply, I'll have to consider you a traitor." The crackle of plasma fire intensified outside. The Gamelin Soldan were closing in. Time was running out. Kyle looked at Lyra, her eyes wide with fear, then back at the opening in the tunnel. He made his decision. "I'm protecting this child, Jenkins. If that makes me a traitor, so be it." He scooped Lyra into his arms, ignoring Jenkins' desperate pleas. "Davis, no, don't do this. You're throwing your life away." He turned his back on Jenkins, on his unit, on everything he knew, and headed for the tunnel entrance. The darkness swallowed them whole. As they stumbled into the blackness, a deafening roar echoed behind them. The tunnel entrance partially collapsed, sealing them off from the outside world. They were alone, trapped between a vengeful enemy and a betrayed ally, with only a fragile hope and a shared tenacity to survive. The tunnel was a claustrophobe's nightmare, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something vaguely metallic. Kyle shuffled forward, one hand pressed against the cold, slick rock wall, the other supporting Lyra. Her small frame trembled against him with each step. The Gamelin tunnels weren't designed for humans, that much was clear. A shower of pebbles rattled from above. Kyle cursed under his breath. A minor collapse, nothing major but enough to block their path. He ran his hand along the newly formed rockfall, impassable. "Damn it," he muttered. He'd have to find a detour and fast. Lyra's injured leg dragged with each step, slowing them to a crawl. Gritting his teeth, Kyle adjusted his grip and scooped her up into his arms. Her weight, though slight, was a burden added to the already considerable strain of navigating the tunnel. A sharp intake of breath escaped Lyra's lips, quickly stifled. The sound, though muted, echoed in the confined space, each vibration a potential beacon to their pursuers. Kyle tensed, his senses on high alert. He spotted a small alcove carved into the wall, a relatively stable pocket in the chaos of the tunnel. He carefully lowered Lyra, letting her slide down his leg until she sat on the cool stone. "Just a moment," he whispered, his voice tight. He needed to check her leg, and they both needed a rest. Reaching into his utility belt, Kyle retrieved a standard issue glow stick, snapped it, and bathed the alcove in an eerie green light. The beam revealed damp, glistening walls, slick with moisture. Strange, bulbous rock formations clung to the ceiling like grotesque fungi. He uncapped his canteen, the metallic tang of the water strangely comforting. Offering it to Lyra, he watched as she hesitated, her large eyes fixed on the container. Distrust warred with thirst in her gaze. Finally, she reached out a tentative hand and accepted the canteen, taking a small, hesitant sip. A flicker of something akin to trust sparked in her eyes. Muffled voices, both human and Gamelin, drifted through the tunnel, growing steadily louder. Footsteps echoed, too close for enforce. They were closing in. Kyle reacted instantly. He gently but firmly covered Lyra's mouth with his hand, his palm pressed against the smooth, chitinous surface of her cheek. He felt the slight tremor in her jaw, the frantic beat of her pulse. His own hand trembled slightly against her face. He noticed it then. Lyra's eyes, usually a dull, insectal black, were glowing faintly in the darkness, emitting a soft, ethereal light. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. An unusual reaction to stress, to fear. Then a jolt. A sudden, inexplicable wave of emotion washed over him, a raw, unfiltered sense of Lyra's fear and vulnerability. It was as if he were experiencing her terror directly, a brief but intense moment of shared consciousness. He recoiled, pulling his hand away. "What the?" he muttered, shaking his head. Stress, exhaustion, lack of sleep it had to be. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a product of his frayed nerves. But the experience left him unsettled, questioning his perceptions. The tunnel widened abruptly, opening into a vast cavern. The green glow stick revealed a space far larger than any natural cave, a colossal chamber filled with the ghostly silhouettes of long-forgotten machinery. This wasn't just a tunnel, it was something else entirely. An ancient, abandoned Gamelin mining facility. Rusting metal frames loomed in the shadows, skeletal remains of colossal drills and transport systems. Strange energy conduits, their purpose now lost to time, snaked across the cavern walls. The air hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a resonance of forgotten technology. The humming grew louder, a low thrumming that vibrated in his chest. It emanated from the depths of the facility, from some unseen chamber further within. It piqued Kyle's curiosity, but also filled him with a sense of apprehension. This place felt wrong. Lyra tugged on his sleeve, her small hand surprisingly strong. She pointed towards a pile of rubble, a haphazard collection of rocks and debris that partially obscured a narrow opening in the cavern wall. Her eyes were fixed on the hidden passage, a silent plea in their glowing depths. She seemed drawn to it, compelled by something he couldn't understand. Kyle hesitated. Trusting a gamelan, especially a child, went against every instinct he possessed. But the approaching sounds of pursuit were undeniable. They were running out of time. He had to make a choice. Trust his gut or trust her instincts. He grabbed Lyra's hand, his decision made. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's go." He moved towards the rubble, pulling aside a large chunk of rock to reveal the hidden passage. Without a second glance, he stepped inside, Lyra close behind. They left the abandoned facility behind, venturing into the unknown. The passage sloped downwards, the angle growing steeper with each step. The humming sound intensified, resonating through the rock and bone. The air grew noticeably colder, a damp chill that seeped into his clothes. He noticed it then, etched into the walls of the passage. Strange symbols, unlike any gamelan writing he had ever seen. They were angular and complex, radiating a faint, almost imperceptible light. What did they mean? And what lay at the end of this tunnel? What did they mean? And what lay at the end of this tunnel? A knot tightened in Kyle's stomach, a cold dread mixing with the ever-present drive to protect the small gamelan clinging to his leg. The passage continued its relentless descent, the rough-hewn walls pressing closer, stealing what little light remained. The air grew thick and stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something else. Something ancient. He noticed the symbols carved into the rock were no longer random scratches. They formed patterns, intricate spirals and geometric shapes that seemed to writhe in the flickering beam of his flashlight. They were becoming more frequent, more elaborate, hinting at a purpose, a language he couldn't decipher but felt in his bones. The humming, a low thrum that had been a background drone, intensified. It resonated through the stone, vibrating against his teeth, making his vision swim. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a pressure building in his skull. Lyra whimpered, her small hands flying to her head, pressing against her temples. Her large eyes, already wide with fear, squeezed shut. The humming was affecting her, amplifying her distress. She was more sensitive to it somehow. Kyle risked a glance at his wrist-mounted comm. Static. The passage walls were too dense, the interference too strong. They were cut off. He gripped his pulse rifle tighter, the cold metal a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. Rounding a bend, the passage opened into a small, circular chamber. A partially collapsed altar dominated the space, its surface covered in dust and debris. Embedded in the center of the altar was a crystal, roughly the size of his fist. The crystal emitted a faint, pulsating light, a soft, ethereal glow that synchronized perfectly with the humming sound. It pulsed in time with the vibrations, revealing the source of the unsettling resonance. As Kyle cautiously approached the altar, a sharp pain lanced through his head. A fleeting image flashed behind his eyes, gamelan figures in ornate robes chanting around a similar altar, their faces contorted in religious fervor. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him disoriented and breathless. He shook his head, dismissing it as exhaustion and stress. But the image lingered, an unsettling premonition that scratched at the edges of his rational mind. What was this place? What was the crystal used for? Lyra tugged at his hand, her insected eyes fixed on the crystal. She approached the altar cautiously, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. Her small hand reached out, trembling towards the pulsating light. "No, Lyra," Kyle said sharply, his voice echoing in the confined space. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. The crystal felt wrong. "Dangerous. Don't touch it, we don't know what it is." Lyra resisted, her large eyes pleading. She made a series of soft, chirping sounds, her equivalent of a whimper. She tugged against his grip, her gaze locked on the crystal. She insisted, her tone firm despite her fear, the gamelan equivalent of its calling to me. He hesitated, torn. He didn't want to risk her safety, but there was something in her eyes, a certainty that resonated with the strange energy of the place. He relented, loosening his grip. Just be careful. Lyra nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out and touched the crystal, her fingertip barely brushing its surface. She winced, a sharp intake of breath, and pulled her hand back as if burned. But her eyes were wider now, filled with a newfound understanding. She looked at Kyle, her gaze intense. She made a series of rapid chirps and clicks, then pointed deeper into the tunnel. She said that she understands what the crystal is used for. She signed urgently that the humming sound is a beacon, a signal. She tugged at his hand, her small body vibrating with urgency. They must move more quickly, she insisted, to get out of its range. The tunnel ahead split into two paths, a dark fork in the earth. Both passages looked equally treacherous, equally unknown. Which way? The sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer. The guttural snarls of Gamelin soldiers echoed through the tunnel, their heavy boots pounding on the stone. They were gaining on them. Lyra looked up at Kyle, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and willpower. She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture of trust, of supplication. She tells him which way to go. Without hesitation, Kyle turned and plunged down the right-hand path. The tunnel widened, the ceiling lifting, making it easier to navigate. But the air was colder here, heavier, and the floor. The floor was littered with bones. Skeletons, ancient and brittle, lay scattered across the passage, their empty sockets staring up at the darkness. Kyle's mind raced. What was this place? A tomb? A prison? Some forgotten Gamelin ritual site? What horrors had occurred here? Lyra turned to Kyle, her large eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He saw a flash of sadness, a profound sorrow that seemed far too deep for a child her age to comprehend. She understands what these skeletons are from, and the sorrow she feels is a sorrow she cannot possibly understand. The tunnel opened abruptly, the stale air hitting Kyle with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the change in pressure, but the stench that made him gag, a cloying mix of decay and something metallic, something acridly chemical. He swept his rifle's beam across the cavern, the light dancing over a horrifying vista. Hundreds, no, thousands of Gamelin skeletons littered the floor, their chitinous exoskeletons cracked and broken, scattered like discarded husks after a harvest. Lyra whimpered, burying her face in Kyle's leg. Even through his helmet he could feel the tremor in her small body. He knelt, pulling her close, trying to shield her from the sight. "It's okay, Lyra, I'm here." Disturbed was an understatement. Kyle had seen battlefields, mass graves, the aftermath of orbital bombardments, but this was different. This was cold, calculated, industrial-scale death. The Gamelin were more ruthless than he'd given them credit for. He glanced at his wrist-mounted oxygen gauge. 60 minutes. Enough to find an exit, maybe. Not enough to linger. "Come on," he said, his voice tight. "We need to keep moving." Lyra tugged at his sleeve, pulling him towards a jumble of rocks at the far end of the cavern. He followed, his rifle raised, scanning for any sign of movement. Behind the rocks, almost hidden by the shadows, was a small alcove, barely large enough for one person. Inside, sitting upright against the wall, was a single, intact Gamelin skeleton. Unlike the others, this one wore simple, unadorned clothes. Its bony fingers clutched a data pad, the screen dark and unreadable. Kyle gently pried the data pad from the skeleton's grasp. It was cold, almost unnaturally so. He brushed away a layer of dust and activated the screen. A complex series of glyphs and symbols filled the display, Gamelin encryption, the kind even Alliance codebreakers struggled with. Schematics of the facility scrolled by, along with fragmented messages, all locked behind layers of digital security. He ran a diagnostic program on his wrist-mounted computer, hoping for a backdoor, a loophole, anything. "Damn it," he muttered. "This is beyond me." Lyra reached out, her small hand hovering over the data pad. He watched, surprised, as she touched the screen. A faint blue light pulsed from her fingertips and the glyphs on the display shimmered, rearranging themselves. The encryption dissolved, replaced by clear, readable Gamelin text. Kyle stared, dumbfounded. "How did you do that?" She didn't answer, her large eyes fixed on the screen. After a moment she looked up at Kyle, her expression grave. "Bad place," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They take mines." The data pad revealed the truth about the facility. It wasn't a prison or a weapons depot. It was a place where the Gamelin extracted information from refugees, those who tried to escape the war, those who knew too much. The skeletons in the cavern were the failed experiments, the ones whose minds had broken under the strain, their bodies discarded like garbage, torture, mental violation. It was all there, laid bare in the cold, clinical language of the Gamelin military. But there was something else, too, a flicker of hope in the digital darkness, an escape route. A secret passage that allowed refugees to flee with their minds intact. It required a passcode, a sequence of mental commands that only someone with telepathic abilities could access. The escape route was dangerous, the data pad warned. It led through the heart of the facility, past heavily guarded checkpoints and automated defenses. But it was the only way out, the only chance for Lyra and for him. His oxygen gauge blinked red. 50 minutes. A metallic clang echoed through the cavern. Then another, closer this time. Gamelin soldiers, they were coming. Lyra tugged at his hand, her eyes wide with fear. "This way," she whispered, pulling him towards a narrow passage he hadn't noticed before, a crack in the rock face barely wide enough to squeeze through. He hesitated for only a moment, then followed her into the darkness. The passage twisted and turned, descending deeper into the mountain. The air grew thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small, circular room. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal, its surface smooth and polished. Lyra walked towards it, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. She placed her hand on the pedestal, and the wall behind it shimmered, then vanished, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside, bathed in a soft blue light, was an escape pod. Freedom, it was so close he could almost taste it, but as they stepped towards the pod, a voice shattered the silence. Well, what have we here?" Kyle whirled around, raising his rifle. Standing in the passage, blocking their escape, was a Gamelin commander flanked by a squad of heavily armed soldiers. The commander's mandibles clicked in amusement. "The girl. We were told she was important, but I don't think even they knew just how important. Seize the Gamelin child, alive." The commander's voice, a guttural rasp amplified by his helmet, echoed through the corridor. Plasma rifles swung towards them. Kyle reacted instantly. He ripped a flash grenade from his belt, thumbed the activator, and hurled it down the corridor. A blinding white light erupted, followed by a deafening crack. The Gamelin soldiers staggered, their insectoid eyes momentarily overwhelmed. "Move," Kyle barked, grabbing Lyra's hand. He pulled her towards the relative safety of the room with the pedestal. As they sprinted, a flicker of something brushed against Kyle's mind. A raw, primal fear and a direction, left. He didn't understand it, but he trusted it. He yanked Lyra to the left, narrowly avoiding a plasma bolt that seared the air where they had been a moment before. A Gamelin soldier, recovering faster than the others, had been flanking them. They stumbled back into the room. Kyle banged his head against the escape pod activation panel, but nothing happened. Sparks flew from a gash in the wall beside it. Trying to leave so soon, Terran. The commander strode into the room, his plasma rifle leveled. "I'm afraid I can't allow that." He gestured, and another soldier fired a precise shot, disabling the controls completely. The commander advanced. "You have interfered long enough. The child is of vital importance to the Gamelin Empire." He paused, his gaze hardening. "She is Lyra, daughter of Dr. Aris, a scientist who defected and stole critical data. Data we intend to recover." Kyle's mind raced. Lyra, data. He looked at the small, frightened child clinging to his leg. She wasn't just a refugee, she was a key. Unknowingly, she carried something the Gamelin desperately wanted. He had to get them out of here. Without a word, Kyle drew his combat knife. He lunged at a junction box on the wall, jamming the knife into a thick power cable. A shower of sparks erupted, plunging the room into flickering darkness. The room's automated defenses, momentarily overloaded, sputtered and died. "Now!" Kyle yelled, pulling Lyra towards a narrow maintenance tunnel he'd spotted earlier. They squeezed through the tight passage, the rough metal scraping against their skin. Behind them he could hear the guttural shouts of the Gamelin squad as they resumed their pursuit. The tunnel twisted and turned. Kyle knew he needed to slow them down. He remembered the schematics of the station. This section was human-designed, human systems. He ripped open a panel on the wall, exposing a network of coolant pipes. With a few quick slashes of his knife, he severed the pipes. A thick, white mist billowed out, rapidly filling the tunnel. "Stay close," he coughed, shielding Lyra with his body. The air grew cold and visibility dropped to near zero. The makeshift smoke screen worked. The Gamelin shouts faded behind them. But the tunnel sloped downward and the air grew heavy, stale. The white mist thinned, revealing a horrifying sight. The tunnel opened into a vast, abandoned holding cell. Chains hung from the ceiling, rusted and broken. Skeletal remains lay scattered across the floor, picked clean. The air hung thick with the stench of decay and despair. And in the center of the cell, chained to a wall, was a lone Gamelin. He was emaciated, his armor stripped away, his insectoid eyes sunken and hollow. He looked up as they entered, a flicker of something hope in his gaze. "Humans," he rasped, his voice weak and strained. You must help me." Kyle cautiously approached, his hand still on his pistol. "Who are you?" "I was part of the Enclave," the prisoner croaked. "The Peace Doctor Kurz, Dr. Aris, Lyra's father. He was trying to reach us. He had information. He was captured before he could." The prisoner's words hit Kyle like Dr. Physical blow. Dr. Aris, the Enclave, it was all connected. "There's a passage. A secret way to the Enclave," the prisoner continued, his voice gaining a little strength. "But it is heavily guarded. I know the way. I can lead you." Kyle hesitated. Could he trust this prisoner? He was Gamelin after all, but Lyra, and the possibility of reaching the Enclave. "Why would you help us?" Kyle asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The prisoner coughed, a rattling sound in his chest. "Because I want to escape this hell, because the war. It is madness, Aris. He was our hope." Kyle looked at Lyra, her large eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. He looked back at the prisoner, his face gaunt and desperate. He had no other choice. "All right," Kyle said, holstering his pistol. "Lead the way." The prisoner shuffled forward, his chains clanking against the floor. He led them down a narrow corridor branching off from the holding cell. Suddenly, the air shimmered. A web of crimson lasers snapped into existence, crisscrossing the corridor. An automated defense system. Too late. The prisoner screamed, a high-pitched, insectoid shriek. The lasers converged on him, vaporizing him in an instant. His chains clattered to the floor, the smell of burnt flesh filling the air. Kyle shoved Lyra behind him, his heart pounding. The corridor was a death trap, and walls were beginning to close in. The grinding of metal on metal filled the air. The walls, lined with smooth black plasteel, inexorably moving inward, sealing them in. The corridor walls groaned, a sound that vibrated through Kyle's teeth, each inch of movement a threat. Crushed durasteel and severed cables rained down, stinging his face. He had seconds. His gaze darted across the closing mechanism, a brutal assembly of pistons and gears that seemed designed to pulverize anything in its path. Pressure points. Control system. There had to be a way. "Lyra," he grunted, his voice tight with urgency. "Focus on the metal, the things that are making it move. Can you feel them?" He watched her face, the large, multifaceted eyes narrowed in concentration. A slight tremor ran through her small frame. He couldn't know what, if anything, she perceived, but he had to trust. Kyle drew his combat knife, a worn and reliable tool, and scavenged a jagged piece of durasteel from the debris. The closing mechanism was a series of interlocking gears, and there was a pressure release valve connected to the primary piston. "All right, kid, I'm going to try and slow this thing down. Tell me if I'm in the right spot." He crouched low near the base of one of the walls, wedging the metal shard into the gears. A faint pressure touched his mind, not words, but a sensation of agreement. Yes. More, he gritted his teeth, bracing himself. He needed more leverage. Dropping the durasteel, he grabbed his rifle, jamming the barrel between the gears and the wall. With a grunt of effort, he leaned into it, putting his full weight against the weapon. A high-pitched screech ripped through the corridor as the jammed gears buckled and twisted. The wall on that side shuddered, its movement slowing to a crawl. A wave of heat washed over him. One down, one to go. Kyle scrambled to the other side of the corridor, repeating the process. Knife, durasteel shard, Lyra's focused gaze, rifle as a lever. The muscles in his arms screamed as he forced the rifle against the unyielding metal. Another screech, even louder than the first, echoed through the cramped space. This time something gave way completely. The wall lurched, stalled, and then stopped, showering them with sparks and dust. The walls stood still, a scant few feet separating them. Kyle and Lyra were pressed together in the narrow gap, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Dust motes danced in the dim emergency lights. He could feel the frantic beat of Lyra's heart against his side. He ran a hand along the wall, feeling for any weakness, any way out. His fingers brushed against a subtle seam, almost invisible against the grimy surface. It was too regular, too precise to be a natural imperfection. This wasn't just a wall, it was a concealed door. He slid the tip of his knife into the seam, working it back and forth. The metal protested with a grating sound. After several agonizing seconds, the seam gave way with a soft click. A narrow opening, barely wide enough to squeeze through, appeared in the wall. The opening led to a tunnel, far smaller and darker than the corridor they had just escaped. It was a claustrophobe's nightmare. "Easy now," he murmured, turning to Lyra. He gently lifted her, mindful of her injured leg, and guided her towards the opening. "You first. Can you make it?" She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. He helped her squeeze through the opening, his hands lingering for a moment on her small back. He followed, wriggling through the tight space. The tunnel sloped downwards, a gradual descent into the unknown. The air grew noticeably cooler, damper. He could sense Lyra's presence ahead of him, a faint warmth in his mind. And then a shift, a change in the atmosphere, a subtle but distinct lessening of tension. "Calm," she projected, the sensation clearer now, almost like a whispered word in his mind. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, a new sound reached them, the faint, but unmistakable murmur of running water. The tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. A natural spring bubbled up from the rock floor, feeding a small pool of crystal-clear water. The air was clean and fresh, a stark contrast to the stale, metallic tang of the corridor. Moss clung to the damp walls, and the gentle sound of the water created an oasis of tranquility. Kyle knelt beside the spring, cupping his hands and drinking deeply. The water was cool and sweet, washing away the grime and fear. Gamelin nature worship. Could this be connected to the enclave? He looked at Lyra, her face illuminated by the faint light reflecting off the water. He had a choice to make. He could stay here hidden, or he could follow the water source, hoping it would lead them to something more. He rose to his feet, his decision made. "Come on," he said, gesturing towards the narrow channel where the water flowed out of the chamber. "Let's see where this goes." The air, thick with the metallic tang of spent plasma rounds above, began to thin, replaced by a damp, earthy coolness as they descended into the spring's passage. Kyle could hear the steady trickle of water echoing off the rough-hewn rock walls, a welcome change from the cacophony of the battlefield. But Lyra coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent a jolt of anxiety through him. He lowered her gently to the ground, his hand instinctively going to her forehead. It was clammy. He knelt by the spring, cupping his hand to gather some water. As he brought it closer, a faint sheen of iridescent oil shimmered on the surface. He sniffed cautiously. A sharp chemical odor stung his nostrils. Gamelin industrial waste. They'd been dumping it into the water table for years. Lyra's breathing grew more labored. The contaminated water, coupled with the shrapnel wound in her leg, was taking its toll. She swayed, her large eyes unfocused. She reached for him, her small hand trembling. "Easy, kid," Kyle murmured, scooping her up into his arms. Her weight was almost nothing, yet it felt like the heaviest burden he'd ever carried. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to hunch over, the rough rock scraping against his armor. He pressed on, each step a testament to his growing willpower. The tunnel opened into a small cavern, a sliver of filtered sunlight piercing through a crack in the ceiling. Patches of moss clung to the damp walls, and strange, bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie glow. Kyle gently set Lyra down against a mossy rock. He scanned the cavern, his eyes searching for anything edible. He spotted a cluster of broadleaf plants with vibrant purple berries. He recognized them lumiflora, safe to eat in small quantities. He plucked a handful, carefully crushing the berries to release their juice. He offered it to Lyra, who hesitantly licked her lips and swallowed. A flicker of recognition sparked in her eyes. She took another tentative sip. As she ate, Kyle noticed something else. A broken twig, its fibers still green. A patch of disturbed earth, the soil darker than its surroundings. Someone had passed through here recently, and judging by the size of the prints in the soft earth, it wasn't human. His gut clenched. Gamelin patrol. They were being hunted. Lyra whimpered, her eyes widening. He felt a faint pressure in his mind, a fleeting image of armored figures and guttural voices. She was sensing them. The telepathic connection, faint as it was growing stronger. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The sound of rushing water filled the air. He crept forward, Lyra clutched tightly in his arms. A waterfall cascaded down the rock face, obscuring a dark opening behind it. A cave. He hesitated. Staying put was risky. They were exposed, but moving on meant venturing deeper into unknown territory, potentially right into the arms of the patrol. But Lyra needed rest. The distant sound of guttural voices echoed through the tunnel. The patrol was getting closer. He had to decide. Now. Without another thought, Kyle plunged through the curtain of water, the icy spray stinging his skin. He stumbled into the cave, the roar of the waterfall deafening. He pulled Lyra close, shielding her from the worst of the spray. He pressed himself against the back wall of the cave, listening intently. The voices grew louder, then faded as the patrol passed by the waterfall. He held his breath, every muscle tense. Then a cough, a small, wet cough that cut through the roar of the water like a knife. Lyra, the voices stopped. He heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn. Clark checked behind the waterfall. A guttural voice barked. Kyle cursed silently. He pulled his pistol from its holster, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it was a losing battle. He was outgunned, outmanned, but he would fight. He would protect Lyra. The waterfall parted, revealing the menacing figures of 3 Gamelin soldiers, their plasma rifles raised. He fired, 2 bolts of energy lancing out into the darkness. One soldier crumpled, but the other 2 returned fire instantly. Plasma seared past his ear, and he felt a searing pain in his side. He dropped to his knees, shielding Lyra with his body. They were dragged out of the cave, the rough rock scraping against their skin. The hope that had flickered within him, the hope of reaching the enclave, was extinguished. As they were hauled away, Kyle's gaze snagged on something etched into the cave wall, half hidden by the moss. A symbol, a stylized spiral within a circle. He recognized it. He'd seen it in old Gamelin texts that spoke of peace and understanding. The symbol of the enclave. They knew he was here. They had been watching. A sliver of hope, fragile but persistent, rekindled in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely alone. Kyle and Lyra were dragged towards a crude Gamelin outpost, a collection of corrugated metal shacks and flickering plasma torches. their future hanging precariously in the balance. The cell was a cage of cold, corrugated plasteel, the air thick with the metallic tang of gamelin disinfectant, and the deeper, muskier scent of unwashed bodies. Kyle's wrists throbbed where the energy cuffs bit into his skin. He scanned the perimeter, cataloging details. 2 guards stationed outside the door, their plasma rifles held loosely but ready. A single flickering light panel casting long, distorted shadows, and the seamless join of the walls to the floor, offering no immediate purchase. The guards' faces were impassive, their insectoid eyes reflecting the dim light like polished obsidian. Lyra coughed, a wet, rattling sound that tore at Kyle's gut. Her small body trembled beside him, her lavender skin clammy to the touch. The wound on her leg, hastily bandaged with strips of his own uniform, had begun to seep again, staining the cloth a darker crimson. The gamelin hadn't even bothered to offer basic medical attention. Bile rose in Kyle's throat. He pulled her closer, murmuring reassurances in a low voice, his words a meaningless balm against the harsh reality. "We'll be all right, kid, just hang in there." He smoothed a strand of her dark hair away from her face, his calloused fingers gentle. His gaze flickered to the guards, then back to Lyra. He would not let them see his fear. He noticed a subtle shift in the guards' posture, a barely perceptible hesitation in their movements. One of them, younger, his chitinous armor slightly scuffed, avoided eye contact. Was it dissent? Doubt. A flicker of hope ignited in Kyle's chest. A moment later, that same guard discreetly slid a small ration pack of water under the cell door. Kyle tensed, ready to react, but the guard simply resumed his post, his face blank. He took the pack and helped Lyra drink, careful not to spill a drop. The water seemed to revive her slightly, but her breathing remained shallow and labored. A harsh, guttural exchange in gamelin broke the silence. 2 officers, their armor gleaming with rank insignia, approached the cell. Kyle didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, demanding. He strained to catch any recognizable phrase. "Daughter, scientist, critical data." The words, fragmented as they were, slammed into Kyle with the force of a plasma blast. Lyra, scientist, data. He pieced it together. She wasn't just some random kid caught in the crossfire. She was important. A target, and that made her infinitely more vulnerable. A wave of emotion, sharp and clear, washed over Kyle. Fear, pain, desperation. It wasn't his own, it was Lyra's. The telepathic connection, faint as it was, had strengthened in their shared ordeal. He felt her terror, her helplessness, as if it were his own. His willpower hardened. He would protect her at any expense. His eyes darted around the cell again, searching for any advantage, any weakness. That's when he saw it. A faint, flickering light, almost imperceptible, danced on the far wall. At first he dismissed it as a trick of the light, but then he realized it was spelling out a symbol, a complex glyph he'd seen before, etched into the wall of the cave where he'd found her. The Enclave. They were watching, they knew. A shadow fell across the cell door. Commander Gorak, a hulking gamelin with eyes like chips of ice, stood before them, his gaze bored into Kyle, assessing, suspicious. "Human," he rasped, his voice like grinding stone. "Why do you protect this?" "Vermin." Before Kyle could formulate a response, Gorak barked an order. "Take the child." Interrogation. "No." Kyle lunged forward, grabbing the bars of the cell door. "She's wounded. She needs medical attention, not interrogation." 2 guards moved to obey Gorak's command, their plasma rifles raised. They wrenched the cell door open and advanced on Lyra. Kyle roared, a primal sound of defiance and rage. He threw himself at the guards, fists flying, desperate to protect Lyra. But the guards were too strong, too well armored. They shoved him back against the wall, pinning him with brutal force. Lyra cried out, a high-pitched, keening sound that echoed in the confined space. Her large eyes, filled with terror, locked onto Kyle's. "No!" Kyle screamed, struggling against his captors, his muscles straining against the energy cuffs. "Leave her alone." He was helpless. He watched in impotent fury as the guards dragged Lyra, kicking and screaming, from the cell. Her small, wounded body disappeared down the corridor. As she was pulled away, a fleeting image flashed in Kyle's mind. A section of the cell floor near the back wall where a grate was slightly askew, the metal corroded and loose. A hidden escape route. She had shown him. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the outpost. The cell shook, dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burning plasteel. Chaos erupted outside, screams and alarms echoing through the corridors. Something was happening, and Kyle knew with a surge of adrenaline that whatever it was their only chance. The cell was cold, the metal biting into his cheek. He tasted blood, the metallic tang familiar after years of war. Disorientation clung to him, a lingering echo of the stun grenade. But beneath it, a cold, hard kernel of grit began to grow. Lyra. He had to get to her. A muffled rumble vibrated through the floor, followed by a chorus of guttural shouts in the Gamelin tongue. The explosion hadn't been an accident, it was a diversion. Hope flickered within him. He shifted, testing the restraints. Standard Gamelin polymer cuffs, strong but not insurmountable. He focused on the floor, his fingers probing the edges of the grate. Loose. He'd gotten lucky. Or maybe, he thought grimly, someone wanted him to escape. Working quickly, he pried the grate free, the rusted metal screeching in protest. The opening was barely large enough, but he squeezed through, scraping his skin against the rough edges. He dropped into darkness, the smell of stale water and decay filling his nostrils. The maintenance tunnel was a claustrophobe's nightmare. Hunched over, he shuffled forward, his hands outstretched, feeling for obstacles. Pipes snaked across the ceiling, forcing him to crawl. The air was thick and heavy, making each breath a struggle. A low groan echoed from the darkness ahead. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he no longer had. Human. A raspy voice, imbued with pain, broke the silence. A Gamelin soldier slumped against the tunnel wall, his armor scorched and cracked. Kyle hesitated, then moved closer. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter," the Gamelin gasped, clutching his side. "They said you were captured, the Enclave. They arranged the explosion to help you." "Lyra, is she all right?" Kyle asked, his voice tight with concern. The Gamelin nodded weakly. "Gorak has her." Interrogation chamber. He wants information about her father's research. "Gorak, ruthless," the rebel spat, a trickle of green blood escaping his mandibles. "High security, but you must try for the child, for peace." He gestured deeper into the tunnel. "This way. I can guide you, but I cannot go much further." The Gamelin struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on Kyle. They moved slowly through the tunnels, the rebel soldier whispering directions. "Gorak. He'll try to break her. She is strong, but—" The Gamelin's words triggered a memory, a sharp, visceral flashback. Lyra, strapped to a cold metal table in a sterile white room. Gorak, his face a mask of cruel indifference, loomed over her. Wires snaked from her head, feeding into a humming machine. "Where is the data, child? Where did your father hide it?" Lyra's large eyes, filled with tears, stared defiantly back at him. She remained silent. A surge of agonizing pain ripped through her small body. She clenched her fists, her palms sweating. Desperate, she unconsciously reached out, projecting a memory, a lullaby her father used to sing. A simple melody interwoven with complex data streams hidden within the Gamelin language. "Sleep now, little one, beneath the silver moons, safe from shadows, safe from pain. The morning comes so soon." The data was hidden in the third verse, in the cadence, in the subtle inflections. Gorak's face twisted in frustration. "You will tell me, child, one way or another." A flicker of doubt crossed his face, a hint of unease. He knew she was hiding something, something important. The flashback ended, leaving Kyle breathless. Lyra. She was so strong, he had to reach her. They reached a junction. The rebel Gamelin pointed to a narrow passage. "Interrogation chamber is that way." "I can go no further." He coughed, a spray of green blood staining the floor. "Commander Gorak is not to be trifled with, human." Kyle nodded grimly. Thank you for everything. The gamelin managed a weak smile. There are others who want peace, but they are afraid. Show them it is possible. Kyle moved silently down the passage, the rebel's words echoing in his mind. He reached a heavy metal door, the interrogation chamber beyond. He could hear Gorok's voice, a low, menacing growl, and then a faint, strained cry. Lyra. He pressed his ear to the door, trying to make out the words. He couldn't, but he could feel it, a wave of pain, of fear, washing over him. Lyra was reaching out, her telepathic cry a desperate plea for Hin. His gaze swept the corridor, searching for a way in. A ventilation shaft high on the wall offered a possible entry point, but it was too small, barely wider than his head. He scanned the floor, his eyes landing on a discarded maintenance tool, a heavy pry bar, its metal teeth glinting in the dim light. It was a risk. The noise. He grabbed the bar, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He jammed the tool into the edge of the ventilation shaft, straining with all his might. Metal screeched, protesting the abuse. Sparks flew. The pain was excruciating, a searing agony that ripped through his muscles. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Meanwhile, a secondary explosion rocked the outpost, closer this time. Alarms blared and the sound of running feet echoed through the corridors. The rebel soldier was buying him time. With a final, desperate heave, the ventilation shaft buckled, the metal groaning as the opening widened. It was still a tight fit, but he could make it. He took a deep breath and squeezed himself into the shaft, the jagged metal tearing at his skin. Pain lanced through his body as he wriggled forward, inch by agonizing inch. The metal cut deep, but he pushed on, driven by a single, unwavering thought. Lyra. Inside the interrogation chamber, Gorok snarled, "Tell me, where is the message?" Kyle dropped from the ventilation shaft, landing heavily on the floor. The sudden intrusion startled Gorok and his guards, creating a moment of chaos. Lyra, seeing Kyle, focused her mind on Gorok. A wave of disorientation washed over him. Il lunged at Gorok, his years of military training kicking in. A brutal hand-to-hand fight ensued, a whirlwind of punches and kicks. Kyle, fueled by adrenaline and rage, fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He landed a blow to Gorok's temple, sending the gamelin commander crashing to the floor. But Gorok was strong and he retaliated with a savage kick, sending Kyle sprawling. He managed to defeat Gorok, but in the process he felt a sharp pain in his side. Gorok had managed to stick him with a blade. Before he could recover, the door to the interrogation chamber burst open, and another gamelin officer stormed in, followed by a squad of heavily armed guards. "He's here." "Secure the prisoner," the officer barked. Kyle grabbed Lyra, pulling her close. "We have to go." They fled back into the tunnels, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. The wounded rebel soldier, despite his injuries, was waiting for them. "This way, I know a way out," he rasped, leading them deeper into the darkness. "The forest is that way." "But I can't go any further," the soldier said, collapsing to the floor. "Go, human, please, tell them there is another way." The gamelin soldier looked up at Kyle. "There are many like me, who are ready to defect but are too afraid to do so." Kyle nodded, his heart heavy. "I will." As they moved towards the enclave, they were ambushed. Plasma fire ripped through the tunnel and Lyra was separated from Kyle. He reached for her, but it was too late. She was gone. The world exploded in a symphony of screeching metal and violet light. Kyle slammed against the corrugated plasteel wall of a HAB unit, the force stealing his breath. Plasma bolts sizzled overhead, carving molten trails into the duracrete. He tasted blood, metallic and sharp, and the acrid stench of burning synth flesh filled his nostrils. Where was Lyra? Disoriented, Kyle pushed himself up, his ears ringing. The rebel Xyler lay a few feet away, pinned beneath a section of collapsed roofing. Xyler's insectal legs twitched. "Lyra!" Kyle shouted, his voice raw. Only the crackle of plasma fire answered. He scrambled over the debris, ignoring the throbbing pain in his left arm. The marketplace, moments ago bustling with desperate vendors and refugees, was now a charnel ground. He found it a small, tattered doll lying amidst the rubble, its button eyes staring blankly at the smoke-filled sky. Lyra's doll. Kyle's gut twisted. He scanned the area, his gaze darting from one mangled stall to another. No sign of the child, but then a smear of iridescent blue blood, gamelin blood, led towards a narrow alleyway, and beside it smaller prints barely visible in the dust. Davis. Zyler coughed, his voice weak. Leave her, get to the enclave. He spat a glob of black fluid. They'll be looking for her. She knows too much. Zyler gestured weakly with a multi-jointed hand, indicating a direction opposite the alley. West, towards the Razor Ridge, hidden valley. Kyle ignored him. Gamelin took her, he growled, his voice tight with fury. I saw the blood, I'm getting her back. Zyler's mandibles clicked in what might have been a sigh. Foolish human, you cannot win this fight. Kyle knelt beside the rebel, ripping a strip of cloth from his own uniform to bind Zyler's leg wound. Maybe not, but I'm not leaving her. He met Zyler's multifaceted gaze. She's just a kid. A flicker of something respect crossed Zyler's face. The transport hub, they'll take her there for interrogation. He winced as Kyle tightened the makeshift bandage. Fortifian, impenetrable. Kyle stood, his eyes hardened. Then we'll find a way in. Zyler shook his head, his antennae drooping. I am finished. Go, save yourself. Not a chance, Kyle said, hefting a discarded plasma rifle. We go together, or not at all. The transport hub loomed in the distance, a black obsidian monolith against the crimson horizon. Kyle and Zyler, moving cautiously through the ruined city, reached its perimeter. Razor wire, energy fences, and heavily armed Gamelin sentries guarded the entrance. Impenetrable, Zyler had said. He wasn't exaggerating. We need a disguise, Kyle muttered, eyeing the bodies of the fallen ambushers scattered around the outskirts of the city. Their uniforms. Zyler nodded weakly. Risky, but our only chance. They moved towards the nearest body, a hulking Gamelin soldier clad in black carapace armor. As they approached, a patrol emerged from the shadows, their plasma rifles raised. Halt! Identify yourselves. Kyle cursed silently. No time for subtlety. He raised his rifle and fired, the plasma bolt vaporizing the lead soldier. Zyler, despite his injuries, managed to take down another with a well-aimed shot from his sidearm. The remaining Gamelin returned fire, forcing Kyle and Zyler to dive for cover. The brief firefight ended with the patrol eliminated, but Zyler was hit again, a searing plasma burn across his chest. Damn it, Kyle said, examining the wound. This is bad. Zyler gasped, his breathing ragged. Get the uniforms, go. Kyle quickly stripped the armor from the fallen soldiers, the metallic tang of Gamelin blood heavy in the air. He helped Zyler into a set, the bulky armor straining against the rebel's thinner frame. You fought well, Kyle said, adjusting Zyler's helmet. I was once a high-ranking officer, Zyler rasped. Before I saw what they truly were. He paused, his breathing labored. The atrocities, the senseless slaughter, I could no longer be a part of it. So you defected? Kyle asked, his voice low. Zyler nodded. I want to atone. To expose the truth, saving Lyra, it is a start. As they approached the transport hub, Zyler's condition worsened. He stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him. Kyle caught him, supporting his weight. I can't. Go on, Zyler wheezed. Yes, you can, Kyle said, straining under Zyler's weight. Almost there. But he knew it was a lie. They reached the main gate, two Gamelin soldiers, one supporting the other. Zyler, drawing on his last reserves of strength, barked a series of guttural commands, citing obscure regulations and demanding immediate access. The guards hesitated, suspicion flickering in their multifaceted eyes, but Zyler's tone brooked no argument. They reluctantly waved them through. Inside the compound, Kyle dragged Zyler towards a darkened administrative office, hoping to find a moment of respite. He lowered Zyler to the floor, the rebels breathing shallow and ragged. Go, Zyler whispered, his voice barely audible. Save her. I am useless. "I'm not leaving you," Kyle said, his voice tight with emotion. Zyler reached up, his multi-jointed hand gripping Kyle's arm. "The access code to Sector 4, where they hold prisoners." He coughed, a stream of black blood trickling from his mandibles. He rattled off a sequence of numbers, then his grip loosened and his eyes went blank. Kyle stared at the dead Gamelin, a strange mix of grief and persistence churning within him. He had to keep going. He had to save Lyra. He moved silently through the darkened corridors, the bulky Gamelin armor feeling heavy and cumbersome. He passed a patrol of Gamelin guards, his heart pounding in his chest. He focused his mind, reaching out, trying to blur their perception. He projected an image of a maintenance drone, malfunctioning and sparking in a distant sector. It was a weak, unfocused burst, but it was enough. The guards paused, their heads turning towards the imagined disturbance. Kyle slipped past them, unnoticed. But he also knew the alarm had been raised. He reached the door to Sector 4, his hand trembling as he entered the access code. The panel flashed green. The door hissed open. The door hissed open, spitting a cloud of chilled, sterile air into the corridor. Kyle braced himself, pulse hammering against his ribs, and stepped through, his scavenged Gamelin pulse rifle held high. This wasn't a holding cell. It was a laboratory. Gleaming white surfaces reflected the harsh glare of overhead lights. Tables were arrayed with humming devices, their function indecipherable but their purpose chillingly clear. Restraints, sized for children, lay discarded on several of the tables, stained with a viscous, iridescent fluid. Small, insectoid tools, scalpels, drills, probes were meticulously arranged on sterile trays. He moved deeper into the lab, his boots echoing on the polished floor. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Behind a bank of monitors, partially concealed by dangling cables, was a darkened alcove. He moved towards it, the pulse rifle rising again. Inside, a surveillance room. The screens showed a single image, repeated across a dozen monitors. Lyra. She was lying on a platform in what appeared to be a shielded chamber, her small body dwarfed by the machinery surrounding her. Cables snaked from her head, temples, and thorax, disappearing into a central console. Kyle's breath hitched. The footage wasn't live. It was a recording playing on a loop. He fast-forwarded, his stomach churning as he watched Gamelin scientists, their faces masked, their movements precise and clinical, preparing Lyra for some kind of procedure. They were attaching the cables, adjusting dials, muttering in their guttural tongue. He slowed the footage, focusing on the readouts on the console. Numbers scrolled too fast to decipher, but the energy signatures. They weren't just seeking data. They were amplifying something, weaponizing it. Lyra's telepathic abilities, rage, cold and sharp, pierced through Kyle's fear. He reached for the surveillance system's power supply, intending to rip it out, but his fingers brushed against a pressure plate. A klaxon wailed, a piercing, multi-tone shriek that echoed through the complex. He triggered an alarm. Shit. He didn't have time to disable the system. He had to reach Lyra. He burst from the surveillance room, pulse rifle raised. A squad of Gamelin soldiers blocked the entrance to the shielded chamber. Their chitinous armor gleamed under the harsh lights, their weapons leveled. The firefight was brief and brutal. Kyle dove behind an overturned table, pulse fire ripping through the air where he'd been standing. He returned fire, the Gamelin rifle bucking in his hands. He was outgunned, but not outmatched. He used the environment to his advantage, flanking, moving, using short bursts of fire to keep them pinned down. One went down, then another. A searing pain lanced through his left arm. A pulse bolt had grazed him, burning through his fatigues. He ignored it, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The last two Gamelin soldiers fell, their bodies twitching on the floor. He grabbed a keycard from one of the fallen soldiers, his hand shaking slightly. He swiped the card through the reader beside the shielded chamber door. The door hissed open. The chamber was small, sterile, and filled with the hum of machinery. Lyra was strapped to the platform, her eyes closed, her face pale. Cables snaked from her body, connecting her to a complex network of processors and amplifiers. A Gamilon scientist stood beside the console, his back to Kyle. The scientist turned, his mandibles clicking in annoyance. "You shouldn't be here, human." "Let her go," Kyle growled, raising his rifle. "Foolish, she is the key to ending this war." The scientist's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. "She is a unique telepath, we are merely enhancing her abilities." He reached for a control panel. "Soon her thoughts will be our weapons. We will crush your resistance, break your spirit, all thanks to this child." He slammed his hand down on the panel. The machine whirred to life, its hum intensifying. Lyra's body arched, her face contorted in pain. A high-pitched keening escaped her lips. The sound resonated in Kyle's skull, a wave of pure, unfiltered agony. He stumbled, clutching his head. He felt it too, a fragment of her pain, amplified and distorted by the machine. He didn't think, he reacted. He focused on the pain, on the sound, on Lyra's distress. He reached out with his mind, a clumsy, instinctive gesture. He pushed against the signal, disrupting the flow, injecting chaos into the machine's delicate equations. The machine sputtered, its hum faltering. Lights flickered. Then, with a deafening crack, it exploded in a shower of sparks and energy. The surge knocked Kyle off his feet, slamming him against the wall. The Gamilon scientist screamed, then collapsed, his body convulsing. Kyle blinked, his vision swimming. He pushed himself to his feet, his head throbbing. The scientist was dead. Lyra was still strapped to the platform, unconscious, but the cables had detached. He stumbled towards her, his body aching. He reached her just as a low, grinding sound echoed through the chamber. He looked up. The shielded chamber's doors were closing, sealing shut. "No!" He grabbed Lyra, lifting her small body into his arms. The doors slammed shut with a resounding thud. They were trapped. He could hear the heavy thud of Gamilon footsteps approaching. They were converging on the chamber. He scanned the room frantically. There, air vents high in the walls, small but maybe. The doors began to buckle inward, the metal groaning under immense pressure. He had to move. "Now, hold on, Lyra." He spotted an access panel near the vents. With a desperate heave, he ripped it open, revealing a narrow shaft. The footsteps were almost upon them. The doors were about to give way. He shoved Lyra into the vent, then followed, squeezing through the narrow opening just as the doors burst open with a deafening crash. Darkness. The vents collapsed and Kyle and Lyra slid into the abyss. The drop was steeper than he'd anticipated. Kyle gripped the edge of the ventilation shaft, the rusted metal biting into his gloved hands. He unbuckled his belt, threading it through the top of Lyra's harness. "All right, kiddo," he whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "We're going for a ride." He secured the makeshift rope, testing its strength with a sharp tug. Lyra watched him, her large eyes reflecting the dim light filtering from above. He could feel her fear, a cold tremor in the air between them. He gave her a reassuring nod, then carefully lowered her down the shaft, hand over hand, until she was dangling in the darkness. "Easy does it," he muttered, more to himself than to her. When she was a safe distance below, he braced himself against the wall of the shaft and began to rappel, the rough metal scraping against his boots. The darkness swallowed him whole, the only sound his own labored breathing. He landed with a splash, his boots sinking into a pool of stagnant water. The air hung thick and heavy, infused with the stench of decay. He pulled Lyra towards him. The tunnel opened into a cavernous space, the ceiling lost in shadow. Water dripped from unseen heights, each drop echoing like a drumbeat. "Where are we?" He muttered, his voice barely audible. He activated his helmet light, the beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were lined with corroded metal and crumbling concrete, hinting at a forgotten purpose. This wasn't just a tunnel. It was part of an abandoned section of the Gamilon base, a relic of a war long past, maybe even predating the current conflict. A metallic clang echoed from above. Kyle froze, killing his light. Gamilon soldiers. They were searching the ventilation system, their heavy boots and guttural voices amplified by the narrow shafts. He pulled Lyra deeper into the tunnel, his hand clamped over her mouth to stifle any sound. The tunnel twisted and turned, a labyrinth of debris and collapsed structures. Twisted metal jutted from the walls, snagging at their clothes. The ground was uneven, littered with broken pipes and chunks of concrete. Kyle moved slowly, carefully, his senses on high alert. Something moved in the darkness ahead. A low growl rumbled through the tunnel. Kyle raised his weapon, his heart pounding in his chest. Two glowing eyes appeared in the beam of his helmet light, followed by a grotesque shape. It was a creature, twisted and deformed, its flesh scarred and mutated. More eyes appeared, surrounding them. These were the results of Gamelin experiments, abandoned and forgotten in the depths of the base. The creatures lunged, their claws scraping against the walls. Kyle fired, the shots echoing in the confined space. He grabbed a length of pipe from the ground, swinging it with brutal force, smashing into the creatures' heads. They snarled and hissed, their mutated bodies writhing in pain. He bashed and kicked his way to Lyra, protecting her from the onslaught. Suddenly, Lyra gasped, clutching her head. He could feel her pain, a wave of raw emotion washing over him. It was the creatures, their fear and agony amplified by her telepathic abilities. She was overwhelmed, her small body trembling. Kyle fought harder, driven by a surge of protectiveness. He had to get her out of here. He scanned the tunnel, noticing a network of smaller passages branching off from the main route. Which way? He felt a faint draft, a whisper of fresh air. He grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her towards the tunnel, hoping it led to an exit. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. The air grew thick and stale, the walls pressing in on them. Dust filled his nostrils, making him cough. Lyra whimpered, but she kept moving, her small hand gripping his tightly. The tunnel opened into a small chamber. Kyle swept his light around the room, revealing a hidden cache of old Gamelin supplies. Rations, medical kits, spare parts, remnants of a bygone era. He grabbed a medkit, his fingers fumbling with the latch. He ripped open his sleeve, revealing a gash on his forearm from the previous firefight. He disinfected the wound, gritting his teeth against the pain. Then, he offered Lyra a ration bar. She hesitated, then took it, her eyes fixed on him. Lyra stiffened, her eyes widening. She reached out to Kyle, a wave of urgency flooding his mind. Soldiers, Gamelin soldiers. They were close, just ahead, searching for them. Kyle grabbed a pipe, his grip tightening. He surveyed the chamber, using the supplies and the environment to his advantage. He set up an ambush, positioning himself behind a stack of crates, waiting for the inevitable. Heavy footing, PS echoed in the tunnel. Guttural voices grew louder. The soldiers were closing in. They rounded the corner, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the darkness. Kyle sprang from his hiding place, swinging the pipe with all his might. It connected with the lead soldier's helmet, sending him crashing to the ground. The other soldiers reacted instantly, firing their weapons. Kyle ducked and weaved, using the crates as cover, returning fire with his pistol. He subdued the soldiers, disarming them and knocking them to the ground. He raised his weapon, ready to finish them off, but he hesitated. He remembered Lyra's reaction to the mutated creatures, her pain and empathy. Could he really kill these soldiers even if they were the enemy? Lyra reached out to him, her small hand touching his arm. A vision flooded his mind, a peaceful place, bathed in sunlight, where humans and Gamelins lived side by side. It was a fleeting image, but it was enough. He lowered his weapon. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't. His light fell on a section of the wall. It was a concealed door, almost invisible against the rough stone. He pushed against it, and it swung inward, revealing a hidden passage leading upwards towards the surface. Kyle heaved, his lungs burning, the air thick with the musty scent of disuse. The hidden passage, barely wide enough for his shoulders, twisted upwards like a serpent's burrow. Lyra, surprisingly agile, scrambled ahead, her small hands finding purchase on the crumbling rock. Almost there, he grunted, more to reassure himself than her. The passage abruptly opened into a vast chamber, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tunnel. Dim, flickering emergency lights cast long shadows across the space, revealing what was once a state-of-the-art Gamelin research facility. Now it was a tomb. Dust lay thick on every surface, coating consoles and equipment like a shroud. Twisted cables snaked across the floor, and the air hummed with the faint, unsettling thrum of dying machinery. Kyle noticed signs of hurried abandonment everywhere. Overturned tables, scattered data chips, a child's drawing pinned haphazardly to a console, a poignant reminder of the lives disrupted by the war. Lyra suddenly gasped, clutching her head. Her large eyes widened, pupils dilating. A faint tremor ran through her small body. Kyle knelt beside her, concern etched on his face. "Lyra, what is it?" She whimpered, her voice barely audible. "Sadness, fear, so much. Gone." The telepathic surge was palpable, a wave of raw emotion washing over Kyle, a chilling echo of the desperation and loss that permeated the facility. Unbeknownst to Kyle, Lyra's surge in power rippled outwards, a faint psychic signal that reached the cold, uncaring sensors of a low-orbit Gamelin patrol drone. The drone, programmed to detect anomalies, altered its trajectory, its optical sensors focusing on the coordinates of the abandoned facility. Deeper inside the facility, Kyle and Lyra discovered a laboratory dominated by a row of towering cryogenic stasis pods. Each pod was a gleaming cylinder of polished metal, its surface clouded with frost. Inside, figures floated in a viscous fluid, their faces serene and peaceful, suspended between life and death. Suddenly, a klaxon shrieked, a piercing wail that shattered the silence. Red lights pulsed frantically. One of the pods, its surface covered in cracks, began to shudder violently. A cascade of sparks erupted from a damaged control panel. Inside the malfunctioning pod, the figure stirred. The fluid roiled, obscuring the face, but Kyle could see the frantic movements, the desperate struggle to escape. Then, with a groan of tortured metal, the pod shattered, spilling its contents onto the floor. The Gamelin scientist, disoriented and shivering, gasped for breath. His skin was mottled and pale, his eyes unfocused. He stumbled, his limbs spasming uncontrollably, a victim of severe cryo-sickness. A jagged piece of the shattered pod had pierced his leg, and blood oozed from the wound, black in the dim light. Kyle hesitated. He knew the risks. Helping this Gamelin could expose them, jeopardize their mission, and possibly cost them their lives. But the scientist's pain was undeniable, his suffering palpable. Lyra tugged at Kyle's sleeve, her eyes pleading. He could feel her emotions, a raw blend of fear and empathy for the fallen scientist. It amplified what he was already feeling, the inherent human need to ease suffering. He made his decision. "Stay here," he told Lyra, his voice firm. He moved towards the injured Gamelin, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side, but then he stopped. He wasn't here to fight. He located a battered medical kit on a nearby shelf. Rummaging through it, he found a bandage and a vial of antiseptic. He approached the scientist cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to help," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. The scientist recoiled, hissing, his multifaceted eyes filled with terror. He lashed out weakly, hissing in guttural Gamelin. Lyra, sensing his fear, reached out telepathically, sending a wave of calming emotions, a silent reassurance that transcended language. The scientist paused, his struggles subsiding. He stared at Lyra, his expression shifting from fear to confusion. He seemed to recognize her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. A low hum vibrated through the floor, growing steadily louder. The patrol drone was getting closer. Kyle glanced around, his senses on high alert. He detected the faint but unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps, the rhythmic clank of Gamelin armor. Soldiers were searching the facility. He needed a distraction, and he needed it now. His eyes fell on the remaining cryopods, an idea, desperate but potentially effective, formed in his mind. He grabbed a nearby wrench and began smashing the control panels of the remaining pods, rigging a cascade failure. Alarms blared, lights flickered, and the pods began to vent their cryogenic fluid in a cloud of icy vapor. The resulting chaos was deafening. "Let's go," Kyle shouted, grabbing Lyra's hand. He helped the injured scientist to his feet, supporting his weight. The scientist was weak and disoriented, but he could walk. They moved deeper into the facility, following a narrow corridor that led away from the main laboratory. The sound of the alarms and the venting cryopods masked their movements, but Kyle knew it wouldn't last long. The corridor opened into a large chamber dominated by a deactivated teleportation device. The device, a complex array of glowing crystals and intricate circuitry, stood silent and inert. It was their only hope of escape. Kyle rushed to the control panel, frantically searching for a power switch. He flipped levers, pressed buttons, but nothing happened. The device remained stubbornly offline. "Power shortage," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. Suddenly, the chamber doors burst open, and Gamelin soldiers flooded into the room, their plasma rifles raised. "Run!" Kyle yelled, shoving Lyra and the scientist towards a narrow side tunnel. He turned to face the soldiers, firing his weapon, providing covering fire as they fled. Plasma bolts seared through the air, narrowly missing him. He felt a searing pain in his side as one grazed his armor. He ignored it, focusing on keeping the soldiers at bay. As Lyra and the scientist stumbled into the tunnel, a plasma bolt struck the scientist in the back. He cried out, collapsing to the ground. Without hesitation, Kyle scooped up Lyra in one arm and hauled the injured scientist over his shoulder. The weight was immense, his muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. He continued to fire his weapon, providing covering fire as he retreated into the darkness, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. The tunnel narrowed, the rough-hewn rock scraping against Kyle's armor. Behind them, the guttural shouts of Gamelin's soldiers echoed, growing louder. He risked a glance back. The scientist, his face pale and streaked with grime, stumbled, clutching a bleeding wound on his side. Lyra, her large eyes wide with fear, clung to Kyle's leg. "There," the scientist rasped, pointing to a barely visible seam in the rock wall. "Ventilation shaft. Old system. They likely don't know it exists." Kyle didn't hesitate. He helped the scientist to the wall, bracing him as he fumbled for a release. A section of the wall clicked open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. The air pouring out of it smelled of stale dust and ozone. "Can you make it?" Kyle asked the scientist, his voice low. The scientist nodded grimly. "Go, I will follow." Kyle boosted the scientist up into the shaft, then turned to Lyra. Her small, insected eyes stared up at him, reflecting the flickering light from his helmet. He lifted her, her weight surprisingly light, and placed her in the scientist's waiting arms. Then, he gripped the edge of the shaft and pulled himself up, the rough metal biting into his gloves. The ventilation system was a claustrophobe's nightmare. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through cracks in the metal. The air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. Kyle crawled forward, the scientist and Lyra close behind. Debris littered the passage. Broken wires, rusted metal scraps, and the desiccated remains of what looked like small rodents. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small junction. 3 different shafts branched off in different directions. Kyle paused, his heart pounding. Which way? Suddenly, Lyra tugged at his sleeve. Her large eyes were fixed on one of the shafts, a look of pure terror on her face. A faint whisper brushed against his mind, a feeling more than a sound, danger. Kyle didn't question it. He pointed to the opposite shaft. "This way," he said, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. The chosen path sloped downwards, leading them to a section of the facility that felt strangely intact. The air was cleaner, the lighting more consistent. Finally, the shaft opened into a small, secure observation room. Below, a massive experimental chamber stretched out before them. In the center, a colossal energy core hummed with latent power. It was a perfect sphere of polished metal, crisscrossed with glowing conduits, and emitting a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the floor. "The teleportation project," the scientist whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and regret. "They abandoned it years ago. The core was too unstable." Kyle's mind raced. A teleporter, it was a long shot, but it was their only chance. "Can we use it?" he asked. The scientist hesitated. "It would require bypassing multiple security protocols, rerouting power. It's incredibly risky." A sudden high-pitched whine filled the air. "Patrol drone," Kyle hissed. "They're scanning the vents." He checked his wrist-mounted scanner. "They've got our heat signatures." Time was running out. "Tell me how to reroute the power," Kyle said, his voice firm. "We're out of options." The scientist rattled off a series of technical commands, his voice surprisingly steady despite his injuries. Kyle worked quickly, his fingers flying across the control panel, rerouting power conduits, bypassing security locks. "Code 7 Alpha Tango," the scientist said suddenly, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. "Use that to bypass the final firewall." Kyle hesitated, a flicker of suspicion crossing his mind. How did the scientist know that specific code? But there was no time to question it. He entered the code and a final lock clicked open. As Kyle initiated the power reroute, klaxons blared throughout the facility, bathing the observation room in flashing red light. "They know we're here," he shouted over the din. A heavy thud echoed from the corridor outside. The observation room door buckled inwards. "Get ready," Kyle yelled, drawing his blaster. The door burst open, and a squad of Gamelin soldiers stormed into the room, their plasma rifles raised. Kyle dove for cover behind a console, returning fire. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, ricocheting off the metal walls. He moved with practiced efficiency, taking down one Gamelin soldier with a precise shot to the chest. Another charged him, bayonet fixed. Kyle sidestepped the attack, slamming the soldier against the wall. "Almost there," the scientist shouted, his voice strained. Kyle glanced at the energy core. The conduits were glowing brighter, pulsing with raw power. He just needed a few more seconds. He took another shot, hitting another Gamelin. He was almost overwhelmed. Just as a Gamelin soldier was about to fire a shot at his head, Kyle completed the power reroute. The energy core surged, unleashing a blinding wave of light. A swirling vortex of energy materialized in the center of the experimental chamber. The teleporter was active. "Go," Kyle yelled, pointing towards the vortex. "Now." Lyra hesitated, her eyes fixed on Kyle. He could feel her fear, her reluctance to leave him behind, a wave of emotion washing over him. The scientist, seeing her hesitation, grabbed her gently. "Go, Lyra," he said, his voice filled with urgency. He pushed her towards the platform. "I'll cover you." The scientist raised his own weapon, firing a volley of shots at the advancing Gamelin soldiers. Kyle grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her onto the teleportation platform. The scientist screamed as a plasma bolt struck him in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. "No!" Lyra screamed, her voice filled with anguish. Kyle didn't hesitate. He activated the teleporter. A wave of energy enveloped them, and the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of light and color. The last thing he saw was the scientist's lifeless body, surrounded by the chaos of the abandoned facility. Then darkness. The world snapped into existence around them, a black void that clawed at his lungs with icy fingers. Kyle stumbled, his boots finding purchase on uneven ground. The air, thin and frigid, burned with each ragged breath. He coughed, the metallic tang of teleportation still clinging to the back of his throat. His first instinct was Lyra. He knelt, his armored hand gently probing her small form. "Lyra, you okay?" She coughed, a weak, rattling sound. "Cold," she whispered, her insectoid eyes wide and unfocused. He felt a pang of guilt. He'd gotten them out, but into what? He glanced at his wrist-mounted display. Ammunition reserves critically low. The teleport had cost them, he cursed under his breath. This was just getting better and better. Lyra shivered violently, her small body trembling. The cold was getting to her faster than him. He had to find shelter and fast. Her skin felt like ice water. Medical danger. Kyle activated his helmet's thermal vision. The blackness dissolved into a chiaroscuro of blues and grays. They were inside a vast cavern, the walls lined with jagged ice formations that stretched into the unseen heights. A network of tunnels branched off in every direction. An icy tomb. Then he saw it. A small pocket of geothermal activity, a faint orange glow emanating from a fissure in the cave floor, maybe 50 meters away. Heat. "Come on, Lyra," he urged, scooping her up in his arms. He started towards the heat source. As they approached, Lyra stirred in his arms. She closed her eyes, furrowed her brow, and then opened them again, looking towards one of the tunnels. A faint whisper brushed against his mind, a sensation more than a sound. "Open. Other side." He frowned. "What was that, Lyra?" She pointed a trembling finger towards the tunnel. It was difficult to tell in the thermal vision, but it seemed to be angled downward. As he considered their options, he spotted them. 3 Gamelin patrol drones, their red optics scanning the cavern, growing closer. The hum of their anti-grav drives was barely audible over the rushing sound of nearby geothermal vents. Damn it. They were pinned, but not for long. They needed to move, and fast. He looked at the tunnel Lyra had indicated, deeper into the cave system, further away from the drones. "Hold on tight," he muttered, adjusting Lyra in his arms. He moved towards the tunnel, his boots crunching on the icy ground. He scanned every shadow, his pulse rifle raised, ready to fire. He had to protect her at any expense. The tunnel narrowed, the air growing colder. The geothermal vent was now a distant glow behind them. Kyle pressed on, guiding Lyra through the darkness, his thermal vision painting a ghostly picture of the winding passage. Then, without warning, the ice beneath his feet cracked. He had a split second to react before the ground gave way entirely. He twisted, trying to protect Lyra as he fell, but it was no use. He slammed onto a narrow ledge, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Pain lanced through his left leg. He groaned, trying to move, but a sharp stab told him something was definitely broken. "Kyle!" Lyra's voice, filled with fear, echoed from above. He coughed, spitting out blood. I'm okay," he managed to gasp, though every nerve screamed in protest. He tried to stand, but his leg wouldn't support him. He was stuck. Damn it all. He checked his ammunition again, even lower than before. He was running out of options, and fast. Lyra peered down into the crevasse, her large eyes filled with concern. He saw a flicker of something else in her gaze, a faint, almost imperceptible glow. Then the whisper returned, stronger this time. "Hand. There. Foot." He looked where she was indicating, his thermal vision highlighting subtle changes in the rock face. Almost invisible handholds and a small ledge just within reach of his good foot. He reached out, his fingers finding purchase on the icy rock. He pulled himself up, testing his weight. It held. "Good," he muttered, finding another handhold and another. He moved slowly, carefully, guided by Lyra's telepathic whispers. Then he saw it, a dark opening in the rock face, a narrow passage leading away from the ledge. "Lyra, there's a tunnel," he said, his voice strained. "Can you make it down here?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She carefully lowered herself, her small hands gripping the edge of the crevasse. He reached up and gently guided her down, placing her safely on the ledge beside him. "Let's go," he said, his voice grim. He didn't know where the passage led, but anything was better than staying here. They moved through the narrow tunnel, Kyle hobbling along, using the walls for support. The air grew colder, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Kyle stopped dead in his tracks. Before them stood an abandoned research outpost, partially buried in ice, a relic of a forgotten era. Hope flared in his chest, quickly followed by a wave of caution. What had happened here? Why was it abandoned? He helped Lyra inside. The air inside was stale and thick with the scent of decay. The outpost was in ruins, equipment smashed, wires dangling from the ceiling. But amidst the wreckage, he saw something that made his heart leap. A damaged environmental suit, lying half buried under a pile of debris. He worked quickly, his fingers numb with cold, patching the suit with salvaged materials, rerouting power cables and sealing tiers with thermal tape. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to protect Lyra from the deadly cold. He helped her into the suit, sealing the helmet and activating the internal heating system. She looked small and fragile inside the bulky armor, but at least she was safe. As he explored the outpost, he found a crude map etched into a metal plate depicting the surrounding tunnel system, a possible route to the surface, a way out. He glanced out of a viewport and froze. On a nearby cliff face, something moved, too large to be a Gamelin soldier, too deliberate to be a cave animal. He felt a cold dread creep into his heart. They weren't alone in these caves, and whatever was out there was very, very close. The shadow detached itself from the cliff face, resolving into something massive. It was a creature, easily 3 meters tall on its hind legs, built like a polar bear but with thick, segmented plates of bone reinforcing its skull and forelimbs. Bioluminescent markings pulsed beneath its thick, white fur, casting an eerie glow in the dim light. Razor-sharp claws, each the length of Kyle's forearm, glinted. The creature roared, a sound that vibrated in Kyle's chest, a primal challenge echoing through the cavern. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the rock face beside the beast. The creature flinched, more startled than scared, its luminous eyes widening. A wave of emotion, sudden and intense, washed over Kyle. Fear, hunger, confusion. It wasn't his own. He glanced down at Lyra, her large eyes fixed on the creature. She was trembling, but not entirely from fear. He moved to the outpost's comm system, a battered console clinging to life with flickering lights. He routed power to the high-frequency emitter, ignoring the protesting whine of the aging circuits. He calibrated the frequency, aiming for a range known to disrupt mammalian nervous systems, and activated it. A keening, almost inaudible sound filled the air. The creature recoiled, shaking its massive head, its bioluminescent markings flickering erratically. It pawed at its ears, momentarily disoriented. Kyle killed the emitter. That bought us a little time. He kept his rifle trained on the creature, though its aggression seemed to have diminished. It's not hunting us, Lyra. It's trapped just like we are, and hungry. A harsh crackle from the outer chamber shattered the tense silence. Gamelin voices, guttural and sharp, echoed through the outpost. They were inside, drawn by the noise. Damn it, Kyle cursed under his breath. He grabbed Lyra, hoisting her onto his hip. Time to go. He moved swiftly deeper into the outpost, away from the entrance, away from the approaching Gamelin. He scanned the walls, desperate for another way out. The outpost was small, a series of interconnected chambers carved into the rock. He spotted it then, a storage unit pushed against the wall, concealing something behind it. He shoved the unit aside, grunting with the effort, revealing a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. This way, he urged, pulling Lyra along. The passage sloped downwards, the air growing noticeably warmer. The smell changed, too, a sharp, metallic tang overlaid with the rotten egg stench of sulfur. Soon they were in a section of the caves riddled with geothermal vents. Pools of hot, mineral-rich water steamed in the dim light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Lyra coughed, a dry, hacking sound that worried Kyle. He paused, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" She shook her head, her breathing ragged. She coughed again, more violently this time. "Air, bad." He checked his environmental suit's diagnostics. The readings flickered erratically. The geothermal gases were corrosive, slowly eating away at the seals. His own equipment wouldn't last long in this environment, and Lyra, without a suit, was far more vulnerable. The passage narrowed further until they were forced to crawl. Ahead, Kyle saw a pile of rubble, a partially collapsed section of the tunnel blocking their path. Great, he muttered. He glanced back the way they came. Retreat was not an option. The Gamelin were closing in. He crawled back to the outpost's main chamber and located a mining laser, a bulky piece of equipment used for excavating ore samples. It was old, barely functional, but it was their only hope. He dragged it back to the collapsed passage, the laser sparking and sputtering as he activated it. "Hold on tight," he told Lyra, positioning the laser. "This might get rough." The laser emitted a high-pitched whine, then a concentrated beam of energy lanced out, vaporizing the rock. Dust and debris filled the air. The tunnel shook violently. Kyle risked further cave-ins with every blast, but he had no choice. As he cleared the last of the rubble, the laser struck something hard, something that didn't vaporize. He reached out, brushing away the dust, revealing a vein of crystals embedded in the rock. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen, shimmering with an internal light, a deep, violet hue. He recognized them from old geological surveys, xantrium crystals, rare and valuable for their energy-dampening properties. Lyra whimpered, clutching her head. The crystals. They were interfering with her telepathy. He could feel her distress, a jumbled mess of emotions, fear and confusion amplified by the crystal's dampening effect. He cleared the last of the rubble, revealing a large, open chamber beyond the passage. But Lyra stiffened, her eyes wide with fear. Danger, big, waiting, and then he heard them. The distinct sound of Ganon voices, closer now, echoing through the caves. They had bypassed the creature. They were closing in. Kyle looked at Lyra, her face pale, her breathing labored. He looked at the open chamber, the unknown dangers lurking within. He looked back at the passage they'd just cleared, the Gamelin patrol hot on their heels. There was no safe choice. He took a deep breath, steeling his commitment. He grabbed Lyra, holding her close. "We go forward," he said, his voice firm. "Safety isn't behind us." Kyle and Lyra cautiously entered the large chamber, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone and something else, something subtly acrid. The place was illuminated by the faint, ethereal glow emanating from countless crystals embedded in the walls and ceiling. They pulsed with a soft, internal light, casting long, dancing shadows that made it hard to discern shapes. The chamber itself was vast, easily the size of a small hangar, dominated by a chaotic array of crystal formations, some towering like spires, others sprawling across the floor like frozen waterfalls. Amidst this crystalline landscape, Kyle spotted what appeared to be an abandoned research setup, tables cluttered with strange devices, wires snaking across surfaces, and glowing screens displaying indecipherable symbols. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of amethyst crystals. It was an elderly Gamelin, frail and hunched, wearing tattered research robes stained with what looked like crystal residue. A strange, crystal-powered device was strapped to its back, humming with scarcely controlled energy. The Gamelin clutched a crude energy weapon, its barrel wavering nervously. The hermit raised the weapon, its multifaceted eyes, milky with age, narrowed with fear. "Intruders, you will not defile this sanctuary." The voice was raspy, barely a whisper. Kyle raised his hands, palms open, trying to project calm. "We mean you no harm. I'm Sergeant Kyle Davis, and this is Lyra. We're just looking for safe passage." The hermit's grip tightened on the weapon. "Humans, here. This is a forbidden zone." But then its gaze fell on Lyra. The hermit's eyes widened, focusing on a series of faint markings on the child's forehead. A flicker of recognition crossed its face. The weapon lowered slightly, but suspicion remained etched in its features. "Those, familial markings. You are of the Lydek lineage." The hermit croaked, its voice still imbued with distrust. Kyle kept his voice low and even. "She's wounded, scared. We need to get her to safety." The hermit hesitated, glancing back at the entrance as if expecting reinforcements. "This place. It is not safe for her, or for you. I am a researcher, studying the crystal's unique energy-dampening properties. I hope to find a way to create safe energy for our people. The hermit gestured weakly at the surrounding crystals. These crystals. They emit a concentrated form of radiation. It's harmful to most gamelin, but more so to her, especially given her unique gifts. Lyra whimpered, clutching her head. Her large eyes were filled with tears and her small body trembled. From the tunnel they had just traversed, the distinct sound of gamelin voices, guttural and harsh, echoed closer. Sector clear. Continue the search. The child must be recovered. Panic flashed across the hermit's face. They're coming, quickly this way. It shuffled quickly behind the research setup, gesturing for Kyle and Lyra to follow. They squeezed through a narrow gap between two towering crystal formations, finding themselves in a small, hidden alcove. The hermit fumbled with a device on a nearby table, retrieving what appeared to be a modified environmental regulator. It was a bulky contraption of metal and crystal, humming with a low, rhythmic pulse. This will filter out the harmful radiation. It's not perfect, but it will help. The hermit offered the regulator to Lyra. The device was powered by a small, irregularly shaped crystal, its light flickering erratically. It's not as efficient as it could be, the hermit muttered, fiddling with the controls. Kyle examined the regulator closely. He noticed a flaw in the design, an unstable energy conduit that was causing the crystal's energy to fluctuate. That conduit, it's not properly shielded. It's causing energy loss. The hermit looked at him, surprised. You know about crystal tech. Kyle shrugged. I know enough. I can stabilize it, make it more efficient. He gestured to his belt where he carried a small multi-tool. If you'll let me. The hermit hesitated, then with a sigh of resignation nodded. Very well, but be quick. With practiced movements, Kyle used his limited tools to carefully adjust the energy conduit, reinforcing its shielding and tightening the connections. Sparks flew as he worked, the air filled with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Within minutes, he was finished. There, that should do it. The regulator hummed with a steadier, more focused energy. The crystal glowed brighter, its light a more consistent blue. Lyra took a deep breath, her trembling subsiding slightly. Her face, previously contorted with pain, relaxed. She looked up at Kyle, her eyes filled with gratitude. Her thoughts, clearer now, brushed against his mind. Thank you. The gamelin patrol's voices grew louder, closer. They were in the main chamber now. Begin a grid search. She must be here, and the human traitor as well. The hermit activated a small device built into the wall. A shimmering field of energy flickered into existence, cloaking the alcove and its occupants from view. This will mask our presence, dampening crystal emissions, but it won't last forever. The gamelin patrol began a systematic search of the chamber. Check the crystal power levels. Any interference could indicate their presence. One of the soldiers approached a large crystal formation near the alcove, holding out a sensor. Power levels are lower than expected in this sector. Significantly lower. They are nearby, dampening the energy somehow. The gamelin patrol's energy weapon hummed, the sound echoing off the cavern walls as they tested power levels. Each pulse sent a shiver through the ancient crystals embedded in the alcove. Kyle's eyes, adjusted to the dim light, caught a flicker in the cloaking device's energy field. A telltale shimmer, almost invisible, but there. The field was weakening. He pressed closer to the hermit, his voice a bare whisper against the rock. It's failing. Their scans are overloading it. The hermit's insectal mandibles clicked in agitation. I warned you this place was not secure. Can you reroute power? Kyle's voice was urgent. From the regulator, maybe? The hermit hesitated, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the faint light. That would diminish the regulator's effectiveness. The radiation. It's a risk we have to take, Kyle countered, his gaze flicking back to the approaching patrol. Unless you have a better idea. The hermit made a clicking sound that could have been agreement or resignation. Very well, but be warned, human, the consequences. Kyle moved with practiced efficiency, his fingers tracing the archaic symbols on the regulator panel. He carefully rerouted power, diverting it from the radiation filter to temporarily boost the cloaking field. The air grew noticeably warmer. A dry cough echoed from Lyra's small form. She clutched her tattered doll tighter, her large eyes wide but silent, betraying nothing to the approaching patrol. The Gamelin patrol moved closer, their heavy boots crunching on the crystal shards littering the cavern floor. Their guttural voices, amplified by their helmets, echoed ominously. Energy fluctuation detected. Sector Gamma 9, investigate. Kyle's gaze darted around the alcove, searching for anything that could buy them time. He spotted a loose crystal shard dislodged from the wall. An idea sparked in his mind. He carefully picked up the shard, its edges sharp against his calloused fingers. He moved to the opposite side of the alcove and with a flick of his wrist sent the shard spinning into a narrow crevice. The impact created a brief, localized energy spike. False reading, one of the Gamelin soldiers barked. Sector Gamma 7, divert. Kyle watched as the patrol, their heavy armor clanking, moved away from the alcove, their energy weapons trained on the opposite side of the chamber. A brief respite. The hermit's voice was strained. It will not hold for long, human, the cloaking device. It is failing completely. Kyle surveyed their surroundings, his mind racing. His gaze settled on a narrow, almost invisible tunnel hidden behind the alcove. It was barely wide enough to squeeze through. There, he said, pointing. A tunnel, it leads deeper into the caves. The hermit eyed. No, that tunnel, it is unstable, prone to collapses, and it leads to regions unexplored even by my people. The sound of the Gamelin patrol was growing louder. They had realized the false reading was a ruse. They were heading back. We have no choice, Kyle said, his voice grim. He scooped Lyra into his arms, her small body light against his. Move. They scrambled into the tunnel, the hermit reluctantly following. The air grew thick and heavy, the scent of ozone and decay filling their nostrils. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. Jagged rocks jutted out from the walls, scraping against their skin. Loose crystals, dislodged by their movements, clattered down the narrow passage. Lyra whimpered, her small face pale in the darkness. Kyle shifted her weight, trying to protect her from the worst of the terrain. He carried her through the most difficult sections, his muscles burning with exertion. Suddenly, a rumble shook the tunnel. Rocks and debris rained down from the ceiling. A small cave-in blocked their path forward. The sound of the Gamelin patrol was getting closer, much closer. He could hear the crackle of their energy weapons as they broke through the weakened cloaking field. Kyle assessed the cave-in, his mind calculating the odds. They could try to clear it, but that risked further collapses, burying them alive. Or they could search for another way out, deeper into the unknown caves with no guarantee of escape. He looked at Lyra, her eyes wide with fear. He looked at the hermit, his face etched with apprehension. The Gamelin patrol was almost upon them. Which way? Kyle didn't hesitate. This way, he grunted, slamming his shoulder against a section of weakened shale. Dust and pebbles rained down, the groaning of the earth a constant threat. He had to clear the tunnel, immediate safety took precedence. Each heave of his shoulder sent tremors through the already unstable passage. The cave-in worsened, chunks of rock shearing off the ceiling, but Kyle pressed on, driven by Lyra's presence behind him, until with a final, desperate push, he found a weak point. A narrow passage opened, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Even before Kyle could speak, Lyra reached out, her large eyes locking onto his. Not with sight, but something more. A feeling, a direction, a path shimmering in his mind's eye. A safer route. The tunnel felt less oppressive, the air less thick. Trusting her instinct, he squeezed through the passage, pulling Lyra after him. They moved quickly, Lyra guiding him with soft, insistent tugs in his mind. He could feel the Gamelin patrol getting closer, their heavy footsteps echoing in the tunnels behind them. They navigated a treacherous path, twisting and turning through narrow crevices, until finally they stumbled into a wider space, a hidden chamber, bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of bioluminescent fungi. The tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing them off from their pursuers. In the center of the chamber, an ancient Gamelin hermit sat cross-legged, his face etched with the wisdom of centuries. Wires and conduits snaked from the walls, converging on a strange, crystalline device humming softly. "You have arrived," the hermit rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The time is near." The hermit worked with a delicate precision, his aged hands moving with surprising speed. He connected Lyra to the device, and a soft, blue light enveloped her. Kyle watched anxiously, his hand resting protectively on Lyra's small shoulder. He felt a strange, disorienting pull in his mind, a fleeting glimpse of complex equations and intricate schematics. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The light faded and Lyra blinked, seemingly unharmed. "It is done," the hermit announced, holding up a small data crystal. "The treaty proposal has been extracted." The data crystal contained a detailed plan for a ceasefire, specifying clear demarcation lines, a phased prisoner exchange, and a system for shared resource management on contested planets. It was a comprehensive, workable solution, a roadmap to lasting peace. Kyle knew what he had to do. "I have to get this to General Petrov," he said, his voice firm. "It's the only way." The hermit nodded. "It will be dangerous. They will call you a traitor." "I know," Kyle replied, "but it's worth the risk." Using a salvaged comm device from his armor, Kyle sent the encrypted data packet, knowing that every second increased the chance of detection. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for confirmation. Back on the command ship, General Petrov stared at the incoming data stream, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "What is this?" He barked at his communications officer. "Encrypted data packet, sir, originating from Sergeant Davis's transponder." Petrov hesitated. Davis, the soldier who had defected, the one who had taken a Gamelin child. He almost dismissed it as a trick, a lure. But something in the data's signature felt genuine. He authorized decryption. The treaty proposal filled the screen, its logic and detail undeniable. Petrov, a veteran of countless battles, recognized its strategic value. This wasn't just some idealistic dream. It was a viable path to ending the war. Against the advice of his staff, Petrov initiated a secure, off-the-books communication channel. He sent a coded message to a known Gamelin frequency, a frequency associated with the peace-seeking enclave. Seeking negotiation, ceasefire terms available. Days turned into agonizing hours. Then, a reply. The Gamelin elder, a being of immense wisdom and authority, responded. "We acknowledge your proposal. We agree to negotiate." A neutral location was established, a desolate moon on the fringes of known space. Representatives from both sides met, the air thick with tension. Human soldiers stood face to face with Gamelin warriors, weapons holstered but hands hovering near their grips. Kyle and Lyra stood together, slightly apart from the main group. Lyra, small but resolute, held Kyle's hand, her presence a silent testament to the possibility of peace. The negotiations were long and arduous, but the foundation laid by the treaty proposal held firm. Both sides, weary of war, were willing to compromise. Finally, after days of intense discussion, an agreement was reached. The peace treaty was signed, a fragile document representing a monumental shift in galactic history. A montage unfolded, prisoners of war streaming across demarcation lines, exchanging tearful embraces with their families. Human and Gamelin engineers working side by side on collaborative projects, building new infrastructure on war-torn planets. The gradual, steady decline of armed conflict, replaced by tentative steps towards cooperation and understanding. Years later, Kyle and Lyra stood on a windswept hill, overlooking a valley where human and Gamelin children played together, their laughter echoing through the air. Lyra, now a young woman, turned to Kyle, her eyes filled with gratitude and affection. Kyle smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He looked out at the peaceful scene, at the children playing, at the rebuilt cities, at the shared future. "You know," he said softly, "sometimes, even in the darkest war zones, the smallest act of compassion can ignite the greatest hope.